Enlightenment is not about escaping life, but about being awake in life. Paramahansa Yogananda taught me something completely different. He didn't deny the tranquility of the mountains and forests, but he emphasized that true enlightenment is not about escaping life, but about living fully in life without being bound by it. You still go to work. You still support your family. You still face joy, sorrow, success, and failure. But something very deep within you is changed. You no longer identify yourself with all of those things. Enlightenment, according to ancient Indian scriptures, is not about achieving something new, but about realizing the true nature that is already present. It's like the sun being obscured by clouds. When the clouds disperse, the sun doesn't appear. It is only seen again. Paramahansa Yogananda calls this self-realization, not becoming someone else, but remembering who you truly are. A very important sign that you are very close to enlightenment in this lifetime is you no longer want to run away from the world. You no longer yearn to leave life to finish your practice. You begin to understand that life is the soul's final school. You learn mindfulness while working. You learn to love while experiencing conflict. You learn to let go even in the midst of loss. And strangely enough, the less you run away, the lighter you become. The longer you stay, the freer you are. The first sign, the silent dissolution of the ego, when the I is no longer the center. One of the biggest misconceptions about enlightenment is that the ego will disappear in some mystical burst of power. The truth is quite the opposite. According to Vedanta philosophy and the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda, the ego doesn't die in a flash, but gradually dissolves in the light of awareness. You no longer feel you must always be right. You no longer feel the need for validation. You are no longer deeply hurt by misunderstandings or judgments, not because you are superior, but because there is no longer an I there to be hurt. One day, you realize that others may not understand you, and that's okay. Others may disagree with you, and you remain at peace. This is an extremely important sign, because the ego lives by reacting, but the awakened soul lives in silent observation. You begin to observe your emotions as waves. They come, they go, and they no longer define you. Paramahansa Yogananda once taught that when you can see thoughts without being caught up in them, you stand on the boundary between ignorance and enlightenment. And if this state becomes increasingly natural to you, without effort, without forcing, it is a sign that your karmic consciousness has become very thin. You no longer live to protect the image of who I am. You live to be present with what is. Second sign, you are no longer searching for truth outside. There is a stage on the spiritual path that I believe most of us have gone through. It is the stage of relentless searching. Searching for better books. Searching for a higher master. Searching for a more powerful method. Searching for a deeper experience. We go from one scripture to another, from one lecture to another, from one spiritual tradition to another. And the paradox is, the more we search, the more we feel we are lacking. Paramahansa Yogananda never denied the value of learning, but he pointed out a very subtle truth. Searching outside is only valuable until you realize where you need to return to. A very clear sign that you are very close to enlightenment in this lifetime is when the hunger for external truth begins to subside naturally. You still read, you still learn, but there is no longer the feeling of, if I don't learn more, I will be lacking. No more panic, no more impatience, no more racing, because within you, an axis of stillness has formed. Yogananda calls this the moment when the soul shifts from borrowed knowledge to direct wisdom. Borrowed knowledge comes from words. Direct wisdom comes from inner silence. You begin to realize that there are questions that don't need answers in words. There are truths that cannot be read. they can only become. Another very subtle sign. You no longer argue about spirituality, not because you lose, but because you find it unnecessary. You no longer want to convince anyone what you believe. You no longer want to prove who is right and who is wrong. You no longer want to preach, because you understand truth needs no defender. According to Yogananda, a mature soul naturally turns inward, like a river slowing down, becoming deeper and calmer as it approaches the ocean. No more rushing, no more pointless meander. You begin to trust your own deep intuition, not emotional intuition, but a quiet, undramatic, and non-judgmental feeling. You know when to move forward. You know when to stop. You know when to be silent. And most importantly, you no longer fear that you will get lost, because you have understood a core principle of all ancient Indian scriptures. The path is not ahead of you. The path is the awakened state of mind you are in. The third sign, pain is no longer your enemy. This is one of the most profound signs, and also the hardest to fake. While living in ignorance, we see pain as an enemy. We fight against it. We deny it. We run away from it. We ask, why is this happening to me? What did I do wrong? When will this end? But Paramahansa Yogananda teaches that the way you face suffering reveals the level of maturity of your soul. The sign that you are very close to enlightenment in this lifetime is when pain no longer makes you resent life. You still hurt, but you are no longer consumed by the pain. You no longer ask, why me? But begin to listen. What is this teaching me? A profound transformation occurs here. Pain is no longer something to be eliminated. It becomes a silent teacher. You realize that each loss is making you lighter. Each wound is making you thinner. Each disappointment is eroding your old self. Yogananda once pointed out that karma is not a punishment, but a mechanism of education from the universe. And when the soul is mature enough, karma doesn't need to strike hard anymore. It only needs to whisper. You begin to feel that. The pain comes, but it no longer lasts as long as before. It no longer leaves heavy aftershocks. You recover faster. You return to a state of stillness sooner. You no longer carry the story of suffering to yourself endlessly. Another very clear sign. You no longer identify yourself with the victim. You don't tell your life story to be pitied. You don't use your painful past as your identity. You deeply understand that what happens to me doesn't define me. According to the philosophy of self-awareness, when you can be with pain without resistance, you are very close to your true self, a place that is unborn, undying, and unharmed. This is why souls on the verge of enlightenment often go through periods of profound trial. Not because they are being punished, but because the final layers of the ego are being cleansed. And the miracle is, when you no longer fear suffering, suffering also loses its power over you. It comes like a breeze. It goes like a breeze. You remain whole, awakened, and more profound. That is a sign that a soul is ready to cross the final threshold of enlightenment. Fourth sign, you become quiet even when life is chaotic. There is a tranquility that doesn't come from everything around you becoming perfect. And there is also a tranquility that cannot be broken by any circumstances. Paramahansa Yogananda calls this dwelling in one's true self. A very clear sign that you are approaching complete enlightenment in this lifetime is when your inner tranquility is no longer dependent on external conditions. Life is still chaotic. People are still unpredictable. The world is still in flux. But something within you is no longer swept along by those waves. You no longer react immediately. You stop. You breathe. You observe. And in that moment of observation, a space opens up. Yogananda once taught that when consciousness is no longer swept away by the vibrations of the mind, the soul naturally enters the state of shanti, peace not created by circumstances. You begin to realize something very profound. Chaos occurs in the mind. Peace resides in awareness. And you no longer confuse these two things. A very subtle sign of this state is, you don't need to say much to prove your understanding. You no longer argue fiercely. You no longer try to win in dialogue. You no longer want to interrupt every discussion, not because you are indifferent, but because you have clearly seen. Most conflict comes from the unobserved mind. This stillness doesn't make you cold. On the contrary, it makes you more insightful and compassionate. You know when to speak up. You know when to withdraw. You know when silence is the most powerful action. According to ancient Indian scriptures, only souls who have accumulated enough awareness through many lifetimes can maintain this stillness in their daily lives. This is not the result of control, but the result of letting go of identification with the stream of thoughts. You no longer feel the need to fix your life immediately. You believe in process. You believe in the profound order of the universe. Fifth sign, your love is no longer conditional. This is one of the clearest signs, but also one of the most easily misunderstood. Many people talk about unconditional love, but very few actually live in that state. According to Paramahansa Yogananda, unconditional love is not a moral virtue, but a natural consequence of blossoming enlightenment. The sign that you are very close to enlightenment in this lifetime is when you love without needing the other person to become what you want them to be. You no longer love to be loved in return. You no longer love to be recognized. You no longer love to fill an inner void, because that void no longer exists. Your love begins to flow from abundance, not from scarcity. You can love someone and still let them be free. You can care deeply without controlling. You can be present without possessing. Yogananda teaches that when the soul realizes its divine origin, it no longer seeks love externally. It becomes love. Another very subtle sign. You no longer love or hate in extremes. You no longer simply divide the world into good and bad. You begin to see the pain behind behavior. You see the ignorance behind violence. You see the fear behind selfishness. This doesn't make you condone wrongdoing, but it prevents you from harboring resentment. You can say no without hatred. You can leave without resentment. You can close a relationship without carrying bitterness. This is a sign of love that has been purified from ego. According to the philosophy of self-awareness, when love is no longer tied to what I gain, it becomes a natural flow, like the sun shining without selection. You don't love because the other person deserves it. You love because it is who you are. Sixth sign, the fear of death naturally disappears. A sign that you are very close to complete enlightenment in this lifetime is when the fear of death no longer controls you, even without trying to eliminate it. You don't need to think about death every day, but when the thought does arise, it no longer causes you to panic. You begin to feel something very deep. There is something within you that was never born, and therefore cannot die. This understanding doesn't come from philosophy. It comes from the direct experience of timeless presence. You have touched upon such moments, when the mind is completely silent, when the I disappears, and only pure presence remains. Yogananda taught that whoever reaches this state, even for a moment, will never again fear death in the old way, because they have come to know, not by faith, but by experience, that consciousness is not limited by the physical body. Another very subtle sign is, you live more fully in the present, not because you fear the passage of time, but because you no longer postpone living. You speak words of love when necessary. You let go when necessary. You don't hold on to unnecessary resentments. Death is no longer something to be avoided. It becomes a natural part of the flow. According to ancient Indian texts, Souls ready to complete the cycle of rebirth often possess a profound serenity before death, not because they are weary of life, but because they have lived with enough awareness to no longer fear loss. And the amazing thing is, when you no longer fear death, you truly begin to live without fear. Namaste.